Welcome to She Defined, the podcast for smart, savvy women who are in search of more. I'm your host, Sharon Green. Today, I am joined by Jana Firestone. She's a therapist who has spent the past 17 years working in the area of grief and trauma. After losing her mother suddenly at the age of 21, Jana was confronted with a tragedy that put her on a path to transformation. She released her first book, Embracing Change, in 2022, and her latest book, Plot Twist, was published in April 2024. She also hosts her own podcast called The Curious Life. Jana, welcome.
Thank you.
So great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Let's just jump straight in because I think there's no other way to do it with topics like trauma and grief, is there?
Rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah. I mean, you've worked a lot with people who are navigating hard life moments and unexpected changes that can result in trauma and grief. It's quite heavy. But I suppose it's inevitable that many of us will go through these sorts of things in life, whether we like it or not. How do you begin with someone who is in the thick of their life-altering moment?
I think it's a great point that you made. It is something that every single one of us is going to go through at some point, certainly grief, hopefully not trauma. But I guess for me, what I'd like to do is meet people where they're at. So everyone is going to be experiencing grief in their own way, and they're going to be along the journey, even and particularly with trauma as well. We can bury it for a long time. So I might meet somebody and start working with them, and they are years away from the event that caused the grief or the trauma, but they're just starting to kind of deal with it now, maybe 20 years later. So it's important to meet people where they're at in that process and just to validate and acknowledge that what they're experiencing is real, because so much of it can come out in other ways, and we might have different symptoms or illnesses or behaviours that are occurring that they may not even have attributed to a previous event until they're sitting in the chair and starting to unpack some of that.
Okay. And so when it comes to navigating trauma, how would you define trauma?
Essentially, I mean, there's so many versions of trauma. We've got the big T traumas and the little T traumas, you know, things that we all know about, like sexual and physical and emotional abuse. That goes without saying. But then there are things like complex trauma and vicarious trauma. And it's essentially a distressing experience that overcomes our ability to process it and to deal with it and to cope.
You spoke before about big T and little t when it comes to trauma. Can you explain what that is in case there's anyone out there that doesn't know?
Yeah, so the big T traumas are those ones like sexual abuse and physical abuse and emotional abuse. Those are huge, huge events in people's lives and take a very long time to overcome. And then there are the little T traumas. For example, even in my life, I worked in the coroner's court, working with people who had either been a family, friend or witness of a sudden and unexpected death here in Victoria. So I experienced something called vicarious trauma. They were all going through, some of them big T traumas. They might have witnessed something horrific, and my job was to work with them through that shock and grief and trauma in the initial stages. So part of my role included going through scene photographs, having to read autopsy reports, having, you know, family members who might request to, and I'm sorry this is a bit graphic, but they might request to look at a photo of a loved one who had been in a car accident, for example. So my job would be to go through the scene photographs, of which there were sometimes 20, 30, and very graphic and very distressing, to find one or two photos that might be the least distressing but give that family member that sense of reality that they're looking for. And I would then take it to the coroner and say, what do you think about these two? And they would have to approve it, and then I would have to sit down with that person and first describe everything that I was seeing in the photo for them to prepare them, and then give them the choice to actually look at that photo themselves. Because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. and when it's your person who you love very much, that is absolutely, the most distressing thing you can imagine. So I was doing that sort of thing day in, day out. And that's all I was doing, was dealing with sudden and unexpected death in a really intense way. And at the time, I thought I was handling it pretty well. I was a few years into the death of my own mum. In fact, I was a bit more than that, maybe 6 or 7 years after the death of my mum. But I don't think I'd really processed my own grief, and I was working absolutely front and centre with other people's grief and trauma. And I think to this day, I'm still in fact, more recently, just starting to do some work on that vicarious trauma, because that complex trauma that some of us can experience, it's about living in this fight or flight state. So you're living in a state of hypervigilance and anxiety. And I have terrible health anxiety. I'm any twinge in the body, and I start thinking of all of the autopsy reports that I've read where there were symptoms along those lines, and I'm sure that that's what I've got. And I know that's not uncommon, and I know many, many people experience health anxiety, but so much of that comes from the almost 5 years that I was working in that place where that was 100% of what that was my experience of the world, is that everyone dies suddenly and unexpectedly and often in traumatic ways, which is not true at all, but that was, my skew on the world, and it has stayed with me. Mm-hmm. So now at 42, I'm dealing with the ramifications and the exposure to trauma that I had in my 20s.
That's so interesting that you can maybe not be directly affected by death, but if you're dealing with it in your job day to day, you're experiencing a version of trauma vicariously through someone else, and that it can impact you in that way. Did you have to kind of have some coping mechanisms in place to still be able to do the job well, but not be taking it on every single day?
I did. I wouldn't recommend them necessarily. But, we as a team, and I had a fantastic team that I was working with, we were very close and we spent a lot of time together. We would go out for drinks after work all the time. I would just try and kind of block it out. I would talk about it a lot. So with colleagues, we would sort of be debriefing all the time. But there was also this kind of, not that it was a spoken thing, but there was this unspoken feeling that, we were all dealing with it, from all the way up from the state coroner all the way down to, the lowest position in the court. Every single one of us was confronted with things like that every day. And there was almost this feeling that, it's just part of the job. So you couldn't really, or it's not that you couldn't, but I didn't feel like I should be going to therapy or getting support for this, because this is just what we do. This is our job. So there was a lot of drinking. There was a lot of, partying and burying and ignoring. And so I don't recommend that. I definitely think we should have been getting more support professionally and, really taking care of the effect of that vicarious trauma from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And when you go through something like that, and maybe you're not processing that trauma properly, how can it manifest? How is it showing up in maybe behaviours or even in your body?
Well, what we know, and there's a really interesting Harvard study, which if you just Google, I couldn't tell you the name of it offhand, but there's all this research that shows if you have unprocessed trauma that you haven't dealt with, you have a much higher risk of significant physical symptoms and health events. The cardiac risk is increased quite significantly, cancer risk, all kinds of things. So, as that kind of famous line goes, the body does keep the score and we can't actually hide from it. So it affects the way we think, the way we behave, the way that we feel, and that will come out differently for everybody. But you might sort of notice that the way you're relating to people is different. You might have behaviours that are being noticed by other people. You might be reactive to things in a way that maybe you weren't before, or that might be out of proportion to what's actually happening in that moment. Or we might have avoidance behaviours. We might have other manifestations, psychological manifestations like anxiety and depression and, the more significant mental health responses. So it really can come out in every single way possible. But the thing to remember is it will always find a way to come out. So we really do have to deal with it.
Which leads me to my next question. Is it dangerous if you're suppressing your trauma and not processing it?
Yeah, it absolutely can be. And it doesn't mean your life is in immediate risk. Living with trauma means that you're essentially living in a space where you don't feel safe, and your world is not safe, your body is not safe, and you might be disconnecting from it. So it doesn't mean there's imminent harm coming. And I just want to really kind of get that point across, because living with trauma, you already feel unsafe. So this is not to add to that. But it just means that at some point, if it's not addressed, it will find a way to express itself another way. So it is important to kind of reflect on what's happened in your life and to have a think about how you can address that, whether that's through therapy or coaching or, any other kind of form of therapy. And it'll be different for everybody, but it's important to address it.
Yeah. You mentioned a few of the symptoms in terms of the way that trauma can show up. Are there any other obvious signs? Because some people may not realize they've even experienced a trauma and are therefore having it all come up or showing up in different ways. As you say, it's always going to show up. Do you have any more examples of how potentially it can show up in a day-to-day life?
Well, again, it is completely individual, so it's really hard to kind of nail it down to one theme. But, a lot of people find that there's a disruption to their life in some way. If there has been some trauma in the background that maybe they're not even aware of, at some point down the road there'll be a disruption, whether it's a form of illness. Maybe, there's a chronic sinusitis, for example, or there's some other kind of manifestation. In women, it can present in menstrual challenges and sometimes fertility challenges. It can really get into our bodies and, come out in any kind of way. So it's important that when these things present, that you do have a good clinician who's going to get a whole picture of what's going on for you, and not just thinking about, what is this physical condition that you're presenting with in front of you? Or if you're having anxiety and it's disrupting your life and you're feeling dysregulated, that you're going to a therapist who's going to take a whole picture of what's going on, not just looking at, you're anxious. Well, what's happening in your life in this moment? Let's look at your entire life and see what we might be able to unpick and reprocess.
And for people who do go and get the help and they manage to work through it, is there kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, in that you can live cohesively with your trauma or alongside your trauma in a way that doesn't feel so debilitating and so uncomfortable every day? What does that look like? Because I think a lot of people are afraid to unpack the trauma because of what that will bring up and what they will go through. But is there something not easier, but, positive that could be waiting for you on the other side of that if you're willing to do the work?
Absolutely. And I think the scary part is imagining what that's going to feel like and what that's going to be like to go through. But there are so many different therapies that you can do where you don't have to be re-traumatized by the events. For example, someone who's trained in EMDR can help you to kind of neutralize those feelings without even having to verbalize the events if you don't want to do that. You don't have to do traditional talk therapy. There are so many different ways around it. But there is always hope on the other side, and we absolutely can live alongside our trauma and sort of reauthor our stories so that you take back some of the power and the control over your story, and you're able to see things from different perspectives that maybe you weren't able to at the time. And so we can integrate that experience in a healthy way.
And I'm sure this is something you're doing yourself right now. I mean, you lost your mum at the age of 21, which is extremely young, and no doubt would have been traumatic. How are you living alongside that now that you've got time, I guess, as a separator between the incident and how you live now? Has that experience shaped you in certain ways?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. So I have now lived just as long without my mum as I lived with her, which absolutely blows my mind because those 21 years with her feel so big and she was such a huge part of my life. I cannot even comprehend that she hasn't been here for the exact amount of time. But it's changed everything about me. You know, it sort of forced me to grow up pretty quickly. I was having a really good time at 21, you know, just living for the night. And, you know, it was all about me. It was all about my friends. I didn't have time really for anything else. And it really forced me to think about things in a completely different way. And it lifted the veil, you know, it sort of took away the fantasy that we are all just these, you know, free-spirited, invincible people, and gave me that kind of horrific reality check that people die and the people we love are going to die. And it's not just going to happen to me. It's going to happen to every single person on this earth, and hopefully with a little bit more warning for most people. But yeah, it's absolutely changed everything about how I relate to people, my perspective on the world, and I think my trajectory in life.
And how does it feel today, living with it today? Is it something you carry alongside you with a lot more ease?
Yes. So I would say the first 10 years were the hardest. And again, it's not going to take everybody 10 years to get to this point. I didn't do the work in the 10 years. I was, you know, thinking I was dealing with my grief because I could talk about it openly and comfortably with my friends and with my family, but I wasn't actually processing it. I was in, you know, achiever mindset mode, just next thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And I think probably avoiding it a little bit. But I got to about 10 years in and it suddenly, I realized that it wasn't something that was causing me distress every day, and I was living alongside it. And now all of these years later, you know, it evolves and it changes shape. I think about mum all the time, but it's now a sadness about what she's missing in terms of my 3 kids and the relationship that they would have had with her, and just having your mum as you become a mum and, you know, having that person to kind of go through all of that chaos with, and that, you know, I guess to have her telling me it's okay and taking over and being able to like dump the kids with her and just know she would be amazing. I mean, that's not to say like I've got incredible family. My dad's amazing. His partner's fantastic. My auntie, my cousins, we're all so close and I'm so lucky, but it's not your mum. And so while I'm not grieving in the way that I was, it's definitely still there.
And so what do you think your loss has taught you about grief?
I think it's taught me that it's not something you just get over. And I remember early on after losing mum, he'll probably kill me for saying this, but my boyfriend at the time said to me, you know, when are you going to get over this? You know, as I'm howling in the bed one night, absolutely sobbing and not coping. And this is probably a couple of weeks in, mind you. And it was so horrible that he said that we just burst into laughter. But I think there was that kind of underlying thought, like at what point do I get over this? How am I ever going to get over this? This is the most horrific, desperate feeling, and I don't want to be here anymore in this feeling, I mean. And when will it be over? And so I think it's important to remember it's never over. We don't ever get over it, but we learn to live with it. And we can still continue to have a happy and successful and joyful life at the same time as missing and longing for the person that we've lost.
Yeah. And I think that's probably what people find difficult about grief is how long is this going to last? What is it going to look like? Is there a way to go through the grieving process, or is that a silly question because it's different for everyone?
Yeah, not a silly question, but it definitely is a completely individual thing. And I think depending on what your background is, if you've been through grief before, you might process the next one a little bit more quickly. That's not to say it won't hurt as much and feel as bad, but you have a greater understanding, and some of the fear around the grief is gone because you've been through the experience again. So I know now that when I go through grief and loss, and there've been many deaths since my mum's death, I know what to expect, and I know it's going to be horrific and it's going to be hard and it's going to be awful, but I will be okay. So I know there's the other side, and I know that I'm going to come through it. And I think it's just about accepting the fact that it feels terrible, and that's okay. We have to feel those feelings.
Which is probably why it's important that we allow ourselves to go through that grieving process. I mean, what are your thoughts around that? Just letting ourselves feel the feelings.
Absolutely. And I think that's the most important thing, particularly in the beginning when you've lost somebody, that you kind of have to remove the judgment from yourself and the expectations of needing to get to a certain point in the grieving process, and just allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you're feeling. And it's not always going to feel like sadness. Sometimes it'll feel like rage. Sometimes it'll feel like betrayal. Sometimes it'll feel like hurt. Sometimes it'll just feel really unfair. And so whatever the feeling is, giving yourself permission to be in that feeling in the moment, and give yourself the time that you need. Like maybe you need to not go to work that day and just be on the couch or be in bed and just feeling miserable, and then knowing that the next day maybe you'll feel a bit better and you can get up and go and do a few things again. But it's about giving yourself that permission.
Mm. Do you think that's something we misunderstand about grief?
Yeah, I do. I think and I talk a little bit about this in my book in Plot Twist, in fact, probably in the other one as well, but I feel really strongly about the closure myth. And I think everybody has been sold this idea that we're supposed to get to a point of closure, which kind of, assumes the idea that there's an end point. And if we haven't gotten to that point by a certain time or a certain, milestone, then we're failing in the grieving process. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because it is so individual. We will go through things completely differently. And there is no end point, in the sense that you don't ever get to a point where you're like, oh, good, I'm over that. Oh, well, mum was a chapter of my previous life and now I'm in my new life, But what we need to understand is that we just integrate that loss into our lives, and it always comes along with us. I'm sure I will think about my mum on the last day of my life, and hopefully that's another 50-something years away. But I don't think we have to be striving for an end point. What we should be striving for is being able to live alongside that, and to hopefully get to a point where it's not disrupting our lives anymore.
The actor Andrew Garfield famously shared that he believes grief is unexpressed love, which I just thought was such a compassionate way to look at grief. And I think about it every time I go through a grieving moment. Do you think that's a positive way to look at grief or experiencing grief?
Yes, I thought that was he's had so many beautiful videos on grief recently, and he just describes it perfectly in my mind. And I do think that grief is just an expression of the love we had for that person. And I heard something the other day that said something like, if we stop grieving for that person, the relationship with them kind of ends. So if we stop missing them and we stop thinking about them and we stop talking about them, they kind of go away. And how sad is that? We want those people who we love and who we've lost to be part of our lives forever. So as painful as it can be, having that longing and having that missing is really important because it's keeping you connected to the person that's not here anymore.
Yeah, it's like your little way of keeping them alive inside, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's actually quite beautiful.
Yeah.
I want to talk about navigating tough times in life. Your latest book, Plot Twist, explores how we can survive life's unexpected curveballs. What would you define as a curveball?
I think it's anything that throws us off our course. And I think whether we consciously accept this or not, we all kind of have an idea of the path that we're on and maybe the direction that we're going. And then something will happen inevitably to all of us at some point where we're thrown off course. And that could be a death, as we're talking about, grief, loss. It could be a change in, the family dynamics. It could be relationship shifts. It could be work-related issues. There'll always be something that comes up. We're not just coasting along in our happy little bubbles all the time. And as tough as those moments can be, it's kind of the excitement of life. You never really know what's coming. And all of those deviations from the path are and will eventually become opportunities for growth.
So would you define it as something we're maybe not prepared for or don't yet have the resilience for, and therefore we find it a curveball because it is tough, it is challenging, it is overwhelming?
Yeah, and I think the key word is unexpected. So often these things happen without us having any idea that they're coming. It might be that you're enjoying your work and then maybe somebody comes into the office and they've got a completely different way of working or a completely different way of expecting things to happen, and it causes ripples and waves in the workplace, and maybe you're not so happy there anymore. Or maybe you're just not enjoying the work anymore. Something's shifted in you and you're thinking, I'm not growing, I'm not evolving, I'm not enjoying this anymore. What's next? Or the big ones, it's like those big T traumas. It's like the big G griefs that, are really the ones that kind of throw us. Maybe a relationship ends. Maybe somebody dies. Maybe somebody's not well. Maybe we're experiencing chronic illness. Maybe we're unwell for the first time in our lives, or we're having mental health challenges. The cost of living at the moment is a huge crisis for so many people, and that financial strain and pressure is a huge curveball for people that maybe haven't had to worry about things like that before. So there's so much going on in our world at the moment that anything could kind of throw us off course. But I think the important thing is not to be afraid of it, because it is a universal experience, much like grief. We are all going to experience these plot twists in life. And I guess it's just about looking at the ways that we can move through them rather than getting stuck in them.
Which leads me to my next question, because you've spoken a lot before about how important it is to go through life's ups and downs, to be able to come out of the other side of it with that growth, with that experience and perspective. What do you mean by going through it exactly? Is that literally getting deep in the trenches of the hard emotions? Can you talk through that process a little more?
Yeah. Look, it's really about kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning of this chat, is meeting yourself where you're at. So removing expectations of the shoulds in terms of where you should be in life, but I should be feeling this, or I should be able to do that. Why can't I, get up and do the next thing? And just accepting what's happening. Now, that can sound a little bit counterintuitive when it's, something big like the death of somebody that we love. We'll never accept it, and I would never ask anybody to be fine with it. But it's about accepting where we are at in that process. So if you are in a position where you've lost somebody and you can't do anything and you are absolutely distraught and you just need to be at home in a heap, not coping for a little bit, I think that's okay. You have to kind of go through those emotions to get to the other side. So you're not always going to feel as desperate as you feel in that moment. But the more that we fight it and the more that we resist those feelings and resist the change and resist that discomfort and bury it, the harder it's going to be to resolve. So we can put the lid on it for so long and then it will come out just like trauma. It will find its way out of our bodies or into our lives. So going through it is just about being honest with yourself about what's happening for you in that moment, in that day, in that week, in that month, and letting it happen. And then, getting some guidance through that is often useful. So whether that's with a therapist or a coach or some kind of practitioner that helps you to move those feelings forward rather than staying stuck in them.
Mm. And why do you think it is so hard for people to navigate these turbulent times or these unexpected changes? What is it about that process that we find so difficult?
Change is scary.
Yeah.
No matter what, change is scary for all of us. And it doesn't matter how practiced you are at change happening in your life, it's always going to be scary. So even for someone like me, I've been through so much change and so many curveballs and so many plot twists, but each new one brings its own challenges. So that's where that resistance and that fear comes in. So as long as we can feel those feelings and accept them, say, okay, I'm feeling frightened, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling hypervigilant because I'm in this fight or flight state all the time. What do I need to do to calm that nervous system, get back into my body, and start thinking about what my next steps are? That's kind of the beginning of accepting that change.
Mm. And when we're in the thick of these life-altering experiences, it can be really hard to recognise when we might be doing a bit better or when we might be starting to come out the other side. What does it look like when people are demonstrating those moments of resilience or transformation or hope?
It's so funny. So often we notice when things are going badly and we're so quick to say to ourselves, we haven't done something well, we're not managing well. And we rarely notice when things are going well until there's been some distance from the event. And then you might look back and go, I haven't actually cried for days now. Wow, okay. Or, I actually got a really kind of aggressive triggering moment happen in front of me and I didn't react. I actually handled that really calmly and I actually managed that well. So it takes a bit of work and a bit of reflection, and it's not necessarily something we're going to see straight away, but you might notice that your parenting is calmer, or you might notice that your relationships are smoother and your interactions are softer. So yeah, again, it'll look different for everybody, but I think as long as we're checking in with ourselves and asking ourselves how we're feeling and how we're reacting to things, then we'll start to notice those shifts.
Mm. Can we get better at embracing change? And if so, how do we do that?
Very good question. I wish I had the magic formula because, you just never know until the thing is in front of you. You can think you know how something's going to go. You can anticipate feeling a certain way. But depending on what else is going on for you in that time, that's really going to inform what your reaction is going to be. So I think underneath it all, we just really need to be kind to ourselves and just let ourselves be human. And if we react badly, it's okay. We can rupture and we can repair. If we're having a big reaction to something, it doesn't mean we're always going to be that person. So I think, embracing change and getting to the place where we're okay with big events happening is something that just happens over time. So I think, just be as kind to yourself as possible.
Yeah. And I suppose that's the wonderful thing about getting older and having life experience is that you may come across, there's that thing again, or I've gone through something similar. I've got the tools and the coping mechanisms to go through this again. Like I have the resilience to get through it. Let's just try and tackle this as best we can instead of feeling like we're unraveling or spiraling into this horrible place. So
absolutely.
That could be a total plus, couldn't it?
Yep. Getting older is a gift, I'm telling you.
What What's one thing that you think women misunderstand about their ability to manage life's plot twists that you'd love them to dispel?
I think it's really important to remember that as human beings, we're actually hardwired to survive these things. So it can feel like we're being broken down by the things that are happening to us, but our brains and our bodies are actually wired to survive these things. So it's just going to take a different amount of time for everyone. And like you say, we're all going to have different strategies and different tools available to us based on our experiences. But we absolutely can and will survive absolutely anything. There's nothing that this world can throw at us that we cannot survive. Even the most unbearable things that you cannot even say out loud and cannot even imagine in your world, even those things we can and we will survive.
Which is actually really reassuring that we know we've got it within us to get through anything that's thrown our way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit of a superpower to just kind of have in your back pocket. Doesn't mean you'll be fine. Doesn't mean it will feel good. Doesn't mean it will be an easy thing. You know, these things, we do suffer and there is pain and real misery and real trauma. All of those things are real, but we can and we will move past them.
And to wrap up, thank you for everything you've imparted so far. But I thought it would be good to end on a point that our listeners can take away today. So what do you think is something small women can do today to make life feel a little easier, even if they're overwhelmed with unexpected change or grief?
I think the easiest thing you can do right now, no matter where you are in your journey, is to give yourself that permission to feel whatever you're feeling. And it doesn't matter how busy you are. It doesn't matter what the expectations on you are from work, from family, from society, whatever it is, you are allowed to feel whatever it is that you're feeling. It doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you small. It doesn't make you not coping, to use an old word from, the terrible days of psychiatry. You're not hysterical. If you need to be a mess, it is okay. And you just need to kind of be your own champion and advocate for yourself for whatever it is that you need. And don't feel silly about it, because whatever you need is what is going to help you get to the next step and then the next step and the next step. So it's one day at a time, as cliched as that is. Whatever you need today, find a way of making that happen for yourself and know that that's one step towards feeling better tomorrow.
What a lovely point to end on. Jana, thank you so much for coming in today and chatting to us about very heavy topics, but I think we've come out the end in a very light way.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely getting deep with you.
Thank you so much for listening to She Defined. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. I've been your host, Sharon Green, and you can learn more about She Defined at shedefined.com.au.